Welcome to Neural Sparks, a crackling series of 3-minute intellectual lightning bolts that fire across the minds of giants. Each episode is a brain-tingling glimpse into the ideas that change the world and the ones still being written in real time. From the paradoxes of Wittgenstein to the neural nets of Geoffrey Hinton, from the integrative visions of Ken Wilber to the computational cosmos of Stephen Wolfram, this series doesn't just inform, it ignites. We leap boldly and briskly through the worlds of physics, computer science, philosophy, mathematics, technology, ethics, and the art of creative thinking, with each spark calibrated for clarity, wonder, and just the right touch of wit. Structured across 10 distinct books, each with 10 episodes, Neural Sparks is your mental espresso shot, sharp, stimulating, and unexpectedly addictive. Think of it as a philosophical power nap, a lab meeting with the universe, or an intellectual tapas bar where every bite packs a punch. Whether you're here to muse, marvel, or just make your neurons dance, these are the sparks that light the circuits of tomorrow. Charge your mind, 3 minutes at a time. Neural Sparks, where brilliant thoughts catch fire. Somerset Maugham lived a life that straddled the worlds of medicine, espionage, and literature, each informing the other in unexpected, often uncanny ways. Born in 1874 in the British Embassy in Paris, he was orphaned by the age of 10 and raised by an emotionally distant uncle in England. His early life, marked by loss and displacement, became fertile ground for the recurring themes of isolation, identity, and moral ambiguity that would define his literary legacy. Trained as a doctor at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, Maugham found the suffering and stories of his patients more compelling than the practice of medicine itself. His first novel, Liza of Lambeth, 1897, based on his medical experiences in the slums, achieved immediate success and allowed him to pursue writing full-time. But Maugham was no dreamy idealist. He was worldly, skeptical, and clinically observant. These traits led him not only to become one of the most commercially successful writers of the 20th century, but also to be deployed as a British intelligence agent during World War I. His time as a spy later informed his Ashendon stories, which pioneered the modern spy narrative with their cold realism and moral complexity. Maugham's great gift lay in his detachment. Whether writing about colonial administrators unraveling in the tropics, the painted veil, rain, or artists losing themselves in Parisian bohemia of human bondage, he observed people like a surgeon, cutting through their affectations to expose their deeper motivations. His style was deceptively simple, lucid, unpretentious, and exacting. Critics often faulted him for being too readable, too plain, but readers devoured his work. He once quipped that the only thing he envied in other writers was their inability to write as clearly as he did. Despite international fame, Maugham remained something of an outsider. He was openly gay in a time when that meant exile and scandal. He travelled constantly, owned a villa on the French Riviera, and entertained a rotating circle of diplomats, artists, and exiles. He was, in his own words, a man of the world, yet he never stopped exploring the subtleties of human psychology and moral compromise. By the time he died in 1965, Maugham had published over 20 novels, dozens of plays, hundreds of short stories, and an autobiography, The Summing Up, that remains a masterpiece of literary reflection. His work, once dismissed as too popular, is now recognized for its psychological acuity, stylistic precision, and enduring power to entertain and unsettle. On a quiet morning in 1896, a 16-year-old boy named Venkataraman lay on the floor of his uncle's home in Madurai, overcome by a sudden and inexplicable terror of death. Unlike others who might have panicked or sought distraction, the boy embraced the fear, performing a mental autopsy on his own body. "This body is dead," he reasoned, "but I am still here, aware, alert." That moment of radical self-inquiry shattered his world. When he rose from the floor, the boy who had lain down was gone, and in his place stood Ramana Maharshi, a silent sage in the making, awakened not through years of meditation or philosophical study, but through the uninvited and irreversible realization of the self. He soon left home, drawn by an inexplicable magnetism to the sacred hill of Arunachala, which he later described not just as a mountain, but as the embodiment of divine consciousness itself. There, in the caves of its slopes, Ramana sank into near-total silence for years, often so absorbed in the stillness of being that he lost all awareness of his body. Monks and villagers cared for his fragile frame, while wild animals sat peacefully near him, seemingly lulled by the same deep tranquility that emanated from the young recluse. Word spread. By the early 20th century, pilgrims, scholars, and skeptics alike found their way to him. Drawn not by sermons or spectacle, Ramana was famously indifferent to evangelism, but by his serene presence and radical message. The self is not something to be attained, but simply to be realized, here and now. His core teaching, Atma Vichara, or self-inquiry, asking, "Who am I?" and tracing that question back to its source, cut through metaphysical speculation like a sword through fog. He welcomed all, Hindus, Christians, atheists, Westerners, without discrimination. When asked about the nature of God, liberation, or morality, his answers were disarmingly simple yet profound. "Be still and know," he would often say. He never claimed to found a religion or system, never sought followers, and lived modestly, dying of cancer in 1950 with the words, "They say I am going away. Where could I go? I am here." Today, his image radiates from countless altars, his teachings cited by neuroscientists, mystics, and minimalists alike. In an age of distraction, Ramana Maharshi's legacy is not a doctrine, but a doorway, a direct path inward, reminding us that beneath the mind's noise and the world's theatre, there is something utterly still, utterly present, and utterly free. In the 15th century, amid the rising currents of Renaissance humanism and the fading echoes of scholasticism, a German cardinal and polymath named Nicholas of Cusa introduced a paradox that would come to shape mystical and epistemological traditions for centuries: docta ignorantia, or learned ignorance. For Nicholas, true knowledge was not the accumulation of facts, but the humble recognition of the limits of the human mind before the infinite. His insight was radical for its time, offering a bridge between science, mysticism, and theology. Born in 1401 in the town of Cues on the Moselle River, Nicholas was trained in canon law, but his intellectual hunger reached beyond legal codes. He lived in an age when astronomers still clung to geocentric models and philosophers confidently categorized all existence in Aristotelian boxes. Nicholas, however, looked deeper. In his seminal work De Docta Ignorantia, 1440, he proposed that the more we learn, the more we recognize how little we truly know. This wasn't ignorance in the usual pejorative sense. It was a learned, cultivated, and enlightened awareness of the limits of human reason when faced with the divine, the infinite, or the truly unknowable. Nicholas likened the pursuit of ultimate truth to drawing a perfect circle with human hands. The closer we come to perfection, the more evident our imperfections become. He argued that God, or the Absolute, transcends all opposites, coincidence of opposites, coincidentia oppositorum, a unity where contraries converge. This principle allowed him to express theological ideas without reducing them to rigid definitions. God is simultaneously one and many, visible and invisible, infinite and yet present in finite things. To understand such a being is not to define it, but to stand in awe of it. What made Nicholas of Cusa truly unique is how he applied this philosophy beyond theology. In mathematics, he questioned the notion that we could ever measure the infinite. In science, he anticipated Copernican ideas by suggesting the Earth was not the center of the universe and that the cosmos had no fixed boundaries. In politics, he advocated for tolerance and dialogue, recognizing that no one possesses the full truth. Ultimately, Nicholas's learned ignorance is an invitation to intellectual humility. It reminds us that true wisdom begins when we abandon the illusion of certainty and enter into a deeper, more reverent inquiry. In an age of algorithmic confidence and relentless information, his words still whisper, "To know that you do not know, that is the beginning of wisdom." Arthur Schopenhauer was a philosopher whose life was defined by solitude, rebellion, and a relentless search for truth beneath the surface of the world's illusions. Born in 1788 in Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland, he was raised by a wealthy but emotionally distant merchant father and a mother who later became a popular novelist and hostess of literary salons. From an early age, Schopenhauer was torn between the commercial life his father envisioned and the life of the mind he craved. After his father's suspected suicide, he abandoned trade for philosophy, immersing himself in the works of Plato, Kant, and the Upanishads. His magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, published in 1818, was a radical vision. He proposed that the underlying reality of the world is not reason, as the Enlightenment thinkers had suggested, but blind, irrational will, an endless striving that brings only suffering. Human desires, he argued, are insatiable. Satisfaction is fleeting. Peace comes only in aesthetic contemplation or ascetic renunciation. The work was largely ignored in his lifetime, as the intellectual world had turned toward the sunny optimism of Hegel, whom Schopenhauer loathed and scheduled his university lectures to compete against, only to find his rooms empty. Bitter and combative, Schopenhauer retreated into a life of books, walking his poodle Atma along the River Main in Frankfurt and treating the world with amused contempt. Yet in this solitude he refined his ideas and wrote with clarity and elegance rare among philosophers. He was one of the first major Western thinkers to integrate Eastern philosophy, especially Buddhism and Hindu Vedanta, into his worldview, seeing in their pessimism a confirmation of his own. Only in his later years did recognition come. Poets, artists, and musicians, especially Richard Wagner, found in his vision a profound psychological and aesthetic truth. Schopenhauer became the philosopher of artists, admired by Nietzsche, Freud, Tolstoy, and Thomas Mann. His notion that the will to live undergirds not just human striving but all of nature influenced psychology, literature, and existential thought for generations. He died in 1860, content in his final years that the world had finally started to listen. Schopenhauer's life was a paradox, a man who believed life was suffering but who produced work of luminous beauty, a misanthrope who understood the human condition more deeply than many humanists. In the end, his solitude gave voice to a truth the world could not ignore forever. In a quiet corner of 20th century England, a young boy named Alan Turing puzzled over machines and patterns, more comfortable with numbers than with people. Born in 1912, Turing was odd in all the right ways, his mind agile, inquisitive, and profoundly original. At King's College, Cambridge, he delved into mathematics with intensity, and by the age of 24, he had written a paper that would become the foundation of computer science. It introduced the concept of a theoretical, universal machine, a model for a computer that could simulate any other machine. This was not just mathematics. This was prophecy. But history rarely waits patiently. With the outbreak of World War II, Turing was summoned to Bletchley Park, Britain's secret code-breaking centre. There, he led the effort to crack the Enigma cipher, the Germans' most sophisticated encryption method. Turing's innovation, a mechanical decoder known as the bomb, accelerated the decryption process and gave the Allies access to vital German military communications. Historians estimate that his work may have shortened the war by 2 to 4 years and saved millions of lives. Yet Turing's genius was not confined to wartime heroics. After the war, he turned to the embryonic field of artificial intelligence. He famously posed a question that continues to haunt AI researchers today. Can machines think? In his 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, Turing proposed what became known as the Turing test, a way to evaluate a machine's ability to exhibit human-like intelligence. Long before any real computer could converse, Turing imagined one that could. He also theorized about morphogenesis, how biological forms arise, using mathematics to describe patterns in nature, from seashells to leopard spots. In doing so, he laid groundwork for modern systems biology, decades ahead of its time. But for all his accomplishments, Turing lived in a society that could not accept who he was. In 1952, he was arrested and convicted for homosexuality, then a criminal offence in the UK. He was chemically castrated as punishment, his security clearances revoked. 2 years later, he died under mysterious circumstances, widely believed to have taken his own life. He was only 41. Decades later, the world began to awaken to his legacy. In 2009, the British government issued a formal apology. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted him a posthumous royal pardon. Today, Turing is revered as the father of computer science. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in Röcken, a quiet village in the Prussian province of Saxony. His father, a Lutheran pastor, died when Nietzsche was just 5, and this early confrontation with mortality would linger in his thought like a dark undercurrent. A prodigy in language and literature, Nietzsche won a prestigious scholarship to the Schulpforta boarding school and later studied philology at the University of Leipzig. At only 24, he became a professor at the University of Basel, the youngest ever in his department, dazzling colleagues with his command of ancient texts and unconventional interpretations. But Nietzsche was never content to remain a mere interpreter of the past. His first book, The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, broke sharply with the academic conventions of philology. He argued that ancient Greek tragedy was not a celebration of reason, but a powerful fusion of the Dionysian, chaotic, ecstatic, and the Apollonian, rational, ordered. The book was savaged by traditionalists, and Nietzsche's academic career soon crumbled. Suffering from migraines, poor eyesight, and chronic illness, he left his post in 1879 and began a wandering, solitary life across the Alps and the Mediterranean, living in cheap rented rooms and subsisting on a meager pension. In his solitude, Nietzsche unleashed a torrent of astonishingly original work. With Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883–85, he fashioned a mythic voice to proclaim the death of God and the emergence of the Übermensch, the higher individual who creates meaning in a godless world. He critiqued Christianity as a slave morality and diagnosed European culture with ressentiment, a spiritual sickness born of repression and envy. In works like Beyond Good and Evil and The Genealogy of Morals, he attacked complacent moral assumptions and revealed the hidden drives behind human behavior. Nietzsche's writing was lyrical, aphoristic, and often volcanic, full of paradox, provocation, and biting wit. He urged readers to embrace eternal recurrence, the idea that life must be lived as if it would be repeated infinitely. To him, the greatest challenge was not despair, but overcoming it. His motto, Amor Fati, love your fate. In 1889, Nietzsche collapsed in the streets of Turin after witnessing a horse being whipped, an act of compassion that marked the onset of his final mental breakdown. He would never write again. His sister Elizabeth, a fervent nationalist, managed his legacy during his decline, sometimes distorting it to align with proto-fascist ideologies Nietzsche himself would have despised. Claude Shannon, the quiet genius from Petoskey, Michigan, changed the world, not with bombs or politics, but with bits. Born in 1916, Shannon grew up tinkering with radios and gadgets, obsessed with puzzles and logic. He studied electrical engineering and mathematics at the University of Michigan before earning his master's degree at MIT. There, While working on Vannevar Bush's differential analyzer, he had an epiphany. He realized that Boolean algebra could be used to simplify and design electrical circuits. This idea, laid out in his 1937 master's thesis, was called the most important master's thesis of the 20th century. It laid the groundwork for digital circuit design, helping launch the entire field of digital computing. But Shannon wasn't finished. In 1948, at Bell Labs, he published A Mathematical Theory of Communication, a paper that did for information what Newton did for motion. With abstract elegance, Shannon reimagined communication not as words or meaning, but as quantifiable units, bits. He showed how any message, text, voice, image, could be encoded, transmitted, and decoded reliably over noisy channels. His theory defined key concepts like redundancy, entropy, and channel capacity, creating the intellectual foundation for everything from the internet to smartphones, MP3s to zip files. Yet Shannon remained resolutely quirky and humble. At Bell Labs, while revolutionizing science, he rode unicycles through the halls and juggled in his spare time. He built machines that solved Rubik's cubes and one that perpetually tipped a burning cigarette back and forth. He once constructed a mechanical mouse, Theseus, that could learn its way through a maze, a prophetic hint at artificial intelligence. Despite his achievements, Shannon never sought the limelight. He turned down many offers, preferring the company of puzzles, games, and chessboards. He believed in the joy of thinking, in theory for theory's sake, and avoided bureaucracy and academic grandstanding. His work quietly undergirded the rise of the digital age. Claude Shannon passed away in 2001, his contributions largely invisible, but utterly essential. Every email sent, every video streamed, every encrypted message owes a silent debt to him. In a world obsessed with data, he was the first to show how to count it, compress it, transmit it, and even, in a sense, understand it. As the mathematician and friend Edward Thorpe once said, "Shannon is the only man I know who could juggle 4 balls, ride a unicycle, and prove a theorem at the same time." Sir Roger Penrose, born in 1931 in Colchester, England, was destined to navigate the edges of human understanding. The son of a psychiatrist and a scientifically curious family, Penrose grew up in a household where dinner-table conversations leapt from abstract mathematics to consciousness and cosmology. That intellectual environment planted the seeds of his insatiable curiosity about the nature of reality, especially the perplexing interface between physics and the human mind. In the 1960s, at a time when black holes were more science fiction than accepted science, Penrose revolutionized general relativity. Using an elegant but then radical mathematical approach called twistor theory, he developed what became known as the Penrose singularity theorem. It proved that under general conditions, a collapsing star would form a singularity, a point of infinite density. This was no longer theoretical fantasy. Penrose gave black holes the mathematical teeth to bite into mainstream physics. His work caught the attention of Stephen Hawking, and together they created a series of theorems that deepened our understanding of the origins and fate of the universe. While Hawking famously turned his attention to radiation leaking from black holes, Penrose never strayed from the strange interplay of geometry and truth. He drew diagrams, now called Penrose diagrams, that compressed infinite spacetime into elegant, comprehensible shapes. Yet Penrose's brilliance didn't confine itself to physics. He ventured fearlessly into the murky waters of consciousness, arguing that the human mind could not be simulated by algorithms alone. His controversial hypothesis, articulated in The Emperor's New Mind, suggested that quantum processes in brain microtubules might hold the secret to consciousness, a theory he later developed with anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff. The mainstream neuroscience community largely dismissed it, but Penrose remained unshaken. For him, true science meant venturing where the evidence pointed, even if it meant isolation. Beyond black holes and brainwaves, Penrose also had an aesthetic sensibility. He discovered impossible figures like the Penrose triangle and helped inspire M.C. Escher's paradoxical architecture. Mathematics, he believed, was not merely a tool for calculation, but a bridge to the universe's deepest truths, a Platonic world of forms that waited, eternal, for minds to uncover them. In 2020, Penrose received the Nobel Prize in Physics for his decades-old black hole theory, proof that bold insights can take time to be seen as self-evident. ChatGPT said, Patricia Churchland has spent her career bridging the seemingly irreconcilable gap between the mind and the brain. Born in 1943 in British Columbia, she was raised on a farm, where the practical demands of rural life instilled in her a no-nonsense attitude and an early curiosity about how things work. Her intellectual journey took her from the University of British Columbia to Oxford as a Woodrow Wilson Fellow and ultimately to the University of California, San Diego, where she became a trailblazer in the field of neurophilosophy, a domain she helped define. Churchland's groundbreaking work began with a simple but radical premise. If the mind arises from the brain, then philosophy of mind must be informed by neuroscience. This view stood in stark contrast to the traditional approach of philosophers who often regarded the brain as irrelevant to discussions of consciousness, morality, and the self. In her seminal 1986 book, Neurophilosophy, Toward a Unified Science of the Mind-Brain, she argued that philosophical problems about the mind, like free will, consciousness, and the nature of self, can and should be addressed using the empirical findings of brain science. The book was both celebrated and controversial, drawing fierce critiques from philosophers and admiration from neuroscientists, including Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the DNA double helix. Churchland's work was not just theoretical. She collaborated extensively with neuroscientists, including her husband, Paul Churchland, and incorporated cutting-edge research into her philosophical analysis. Her insistence on getting one's hands dirty with the data made her an unusual figure in philosophy, a thinker who moved comfortably between lab meetings and seminars. She saw no shame in revising or even discarding philosophical positions that were contradicted by empirical evidence. Over the years, her work expanded into moral psychology, particularly the biological roots of ethics. In Brain Trust, What Neuroscience Tells Us About Morality, 2011, she proposed that our moral behavior is deeply rooted in brain mechanisms shaped by evolution, particularly those related to attachment and social bonding. Rather than deriving morality from abstract principles, she traced it to oxytocin, the vagus nerve, and other neurochemical and anatomical systems. This view emphasized the evolutionary continuity between humans and animals, challenging notions of human moral exceptionalism. Patricia Churchland's legacy is that of a philosophical heretic and pioneer. She brought the brain into philosophy, not as a metaphor, but as a foundational subject of study. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling rogue of Hollywood's golden age, lived a life that defied easy definition. Born in 1909 in Tasmania to a stern marine biologist father and a mother who doted on him, Flynn's early life was shaped by contrasts between science and wildness, discipline and rebellion. He was expelled from multiple schools, fought in boxing rings, sailed across oceans, and hunted for gold in New Guinea before stumbling into acting. His uncontainable energy and devil-may-care charm caught the attention of Warner Brothers, launching him into superstardom with Captain Blood, 1935. But behind the rakish grin and the swordplay was a man deeply curious about the human condition, forever seeking, often disillusioned, and frequently masking his introspection with bravado. Flynn's philosophical outlook was more complex than his public image suggested. In his later writings, particularly in his memoir, My Wicked, Wicked Ways, Flynn reveals himself as a cynic, plagued by the absurdities of fame and the emptiness of Hollywood's glamour. He flirted with existentialism long before it was fashionable, repeatedly returning to themes of fate, freedom, and the futility of permanence. "I've lived by a code," he once said, "but it was a code I made up as I went along." That code, however improvised, revolved around the pursuit of vitality, adventure, pleasure, knowledge, and a distrust of rigid morality. He saw life as theatre, and himself as both actor and director, fated to play roles that both liberated and confined him. Flynn was drawn to thinkers like Nietzsche and Spinoza, and often pondered the nature of courage, mortality, and personal truth. In interviews, he dismissed religion, but held a quiet reverence for nature and human emotion, once writing that, "The closest thing to God I've seen is the sea at sunrise." His global travels, sailing the Caribbean, crossing war zones as a correspondent, and reading deeply on long voyages, fueled his intellectual curiosity, even as his body paid the price for his hedonism. Despite his reputation as a libertine, Flynn's mind remained unsettled, restless. He feared old age, not just for its physical decline, but for the loss of spontaneity and myth. In his last years, broke and worn, he still approached life with a kind of tragic heroism, aware of his flaws, yet unrepentant. Errol Flynn died in 1959 at just 50, leaving behind a trail of scandal, laughter, and a legacy steeped in contradiction. To the world, he was a dashing rogue. To himself, he was a philosopher without a school.